The Bishop estate loomed ahead like something out of a Gothic novel, all wrought iron gates and limestone columns that screamed old money louder than a Texas oil derrick. I smoothed my navy dress one last time as Ethan pulled up the circular drive, gravel crunching under the tires like broken promises. "You look beautiful, Clara," he said, but his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. We'd had this conversation 3 times on the drive over. His family could be difficult. That was his word. Mine would have been crueler. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The front door opened before we even knocked. Margaret Bishop stood there in pearl earrings that probably cost more than most people's cars, her smile as perfectly practiced as her posture. Behind her, the foyer stretched back into shadows, punctuated by oil paintings of dead bishops, all of them looking down with the same expression of polite disapproval I'd grown to know so well. "Clara, darling," Margaret said, air kissing my cheeks with the warmth of a funeral director. "How lovely that you could join us." That you could join us, like I was a guest, not family. Like I was lucky to be invited to my own husband's family dinner. But I smiled anyway because that's what I did. I kept the peace. "Thank you for having me, Margaret. The house looks beautiful." And it did. Every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that came from generations of wealth, the kind that hired people to clean things you'd never think to clean. Crystal chandeliers caught the light like frozen fireworks. The air smelled of lemon oil and old leather, money and tradition wrapped up in one suffocating package. Ethan's hand found mine as we followed Margaret deeper into the house, past trophy cases filled with ribbons from horse shows I'd never heard of, past photographs of charity galas where everyone wore the same smile Margaret was wearing now. His palm was sweating. "Henry's in the study finishing up some business calls," Margaret said, leading us into a sitting room where everything was cream and gold and probably worth more than my childhood home. "Juliet and Carter should be down shortly." She gestured for us to sit on a sofa that looked like it had never been sat on, then perched across from us like a bird of prey. Her eyes took inventory. My shoes, my purse, the way I held my hands. I could practically see her mental calculator running, adding up retail prices and finding them wanting. "That's a lovely dress," she said, finally, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that made your teeth ache. "Off the rack can be so practical." The words hit like a slap wrapped in silk. Ethan's grip on my hand tightened, but he didn't speak. Never did, just sat there while his mother served up insults disguised as compliments, while his siblings made comments that sliced just deep enough to draw blood but not deep enough to call out. I thought about the trust fund sitting in my bank account. $90 million that I'd inherited from the grandfather I barely knew. The man who left my mother when she was 17 and pregnant, then spent 30 years feeling guilty about it. Enough money to buy this entire house and use it as a summer cottage. But they didn't know that. Nobody did, except my lawyer and the bank manager who sent me quarterly statements I barely looked at. I kept it secret for a reason. Money changed people. It made them see dollar signs instead of your face, made you calculate your worth in decimal points instead of character. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. Stupid me, thinking that would be enough. I said, "Thank you," my voice steady as Sunday morning. "I've always believed in investing in quality pieces that will last." Margaret's smile flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. The first crack in her perfect facade. Footsteps clattered down the marble staircase, and Juliet appeared in the doorway like she was walking a runway. 28 years old and still living off Daddy's money, but she wore it well. Behind her, Carter slouched in wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Clara," Juliet squealed, rushing over for a hug that felt about as genuine as a $3 bill. "You look surprisingly tasteful for off the rack." There it was again, the casual cruelty that the Bishop family had perfected like an art form. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one small enough to ignore, all of them together enough to bleed you dry. Carter nodded in my direction like I was the help, then immediately turned to Ethan. Dad's been talking about the Riverside development all week, says it's going to change everything. The deal of a lifetime, Juliet added, settling into the chair next to Margaret with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. All the right people. Code for people like them. People with the right last names, the right addresses, the right pedigree. Not people like me who grew up single-wide with a mother who worked double shifts to keep the lights on. I felt Ethan shift beside me, his wedding ring catching the light as he cleared his throat. Clara's been working on some interesting projects, too. Maybe we should— Oh, that's sweet, Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempt at deflection like a butter knife through warm bread. What is it you do again, dear? Something with computers. She said it was like I cleaned them instead of programming them, like I was some kind of janitor instead of someone who'd helped build systems that ran half the city's infrastructure. But correcting her would be rude, wouldn't it? Would upset the delicate balance they'd all worked so hard to maintain. Data analysis and system integration, I said quietly. I help businesses optimize their operations. How technical, Juliet said, examining her manicured nails like they held the secrets of the universe. I could never wrap my head around all those numbers and whatnot. Whatnot. My entire career was reduced to whatnot. Henry's voice boomed from the hallway before I could respond. Is that my daughter-in-law I hear? Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He appeared in the doorway, tall and imposing in the way that rich men always seem to be. His handshake was firm, his smile calculating. I could practically see him sizing me up, determining my net worth and finding it lacking. Clara, he said, my name sounding foreign in his mouth. Good to see you again. Again. Like we hadn't spent Christmas together just 3 months ago. Like we hadn't sat at their table while they talked around me instead of to me, while they made plans that affected my husband without asking my opinion, while they treated me like a temporary inconvenience instead of family. Dinner should be ready shortly, Margaret announced, rising with the grace of a woman who'd never wondered if she belonged anywhere. I hope everyone brought their appetites. I had brought mine, though not for food. I was hungry for something else entirely. Recognition, respect. The simple acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered, that I was more than just the girl who'd somehow tricked their precious son into marriage. But as we filed toward the dining room, Ethan's family chattering about business deals and social events I'd never been invited to, I swallowed that hunger down like I always did. Pushed it deep where it couldn't embarrass anyone, couldn't upset the careful balance that kept the Bishop family machine running smoothly. After all, what was one more insult in the grand scheme of things? What was one more night of being invisible in my own life? I was about to find out. The dining room stretched before us like a battlefield disguised as elegance. A mahogany table that could have seated a small army dominated the space, surrounded by chairs that looked like thrones for people who'd never questioned their right to sit in them. Crystal glasses caught the light from a chandelier that probably weighed more than my car, casting rainbows across china plates that bore the Bishop family crest. I found myself seated between Ethan and Carter, which felt strategic. Margaret had positioned herself at the head of the table like a general surveying her troops, while Henry claimed his spot at the opposite end with the authority of a king. Juliet sat across from me, her perfectly contoured face lit by candlelight that made her look like she was posing for a magazine shoot. The first course arrived without fanfare, some kind of soup that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. I watched as everyone else lifted their spoons with the casual confidence of people who'd been eating on fine china since they could hold utensils. I followed their lead, not trying to think about the chip bowls I'd grown up eating cereal from. So, Henry, Margaret began, her voice cutting through the quiet clink of silver against porcelain, tell everyone about the Riverside development. Henry's chest puffed with pride as he set down his spoon. Biggest deal of my career, possibly. We're talking about transforming 300 acres of prime real estate into luxury residential and commercial space. Golf course, shopping center, the works. The environmental impact studies alone cost more than most people make in a year, Carter added. Like casual destruction of nature was something to brag about. But it's worth it, Juliet chimed in, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from watching money multiply. Plus, we're working with all the right people, the Weatherbys, the Astors, the Vandenberg family. There it was again, the right people. Their favorite phrase, the one they used to separate the worthy from the unworthy, the acceptable from the trash. I took a careful sip of wine, letting the vintage coat my throat like liquid silk. At least they had good taste in something. It's quite an undertaking, I said quietly, genuinely interested despite myself. What's the timeline for development? Henry looked surprised that I'd spoken, like he'd forgotten I was there. 18 months for Phase 1, assuming we can finalize the land acquisition. There are a few complications with some of the property ownership, but nothing we can't handle. Complications? I asked, keeping my voice light and curious. Oh, you know how these things go, Margaret waved dismissively. Some of the land is tied up in old family trusts, that sort of thing. People who don't understand the value of progress. People like me, her tone suggested. People who didn't appreciate the grand vision of turning raw land into profit margins. Family trusts can be tricky, I said, thinking of my own. The legal requirements alone. Nothing a good lawyer can't sort out, Henry interrupted, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Most of these old trusts are poorly managed anyway. People inherit money they don't know how to handle. The irony almost made me choke on my soup. If he only knew. Speaking of inheritance, Juliet said, her voice taking on that particular tone of mock concern I'd come to recognize. Clara, didn't you mention your family had some challenges in that area? My spoon paused halfway to my mouth. We were venturing into dangerous territory now, the kind of personal attack disguised as polite interest that the Bishop family had weaponized into an art form. My family's financial situation was certainly different from yours, I said carefully. Different, Carter repeated, like he was tasting the word and finding it amusing. That's one way to put it. I felt Ethan tense beside me, his jaw tightening in that way it did when he was preparing to say something he should have said months ago. But Margaret spoke first. Oh, we're not judging, dear, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Everyone comes from different circumstances. It's just interesting to see how far people can travel from their roots. Travel from their roots. Code for remember where you came from, and remember it isn't here. Clara's worked very hard to build her career, Ethan said finally, his voice strained with the effort of defending me without offending them. It was a tightrope walk he'd been performing for 3 years, and he was getting tired of the balancing act. Oh, absolutely, Margaret agreed, but there was something sharp in her smile now. It must be quite an adjustment, though, coming from such humble beginnings to all this. She gestured around the room like she was showcasing paradise, like I should be grateful for the privilege of sitting in their perfect dining room, eating their perfect food, swallowing their perfect insults. Sometimes the biggest adjustments are the ones people don't see coming, I said quietly, thinking of all the ways my life had changed since inheriting grandfather's trust. The weight of secrets, the burden of hiding who I really was. What do you mean by that? Juliet asked, leaning forward like a shark scenting blood in the water. I met her eyes across the table, seeing my own reflection in her predatory gaze. Just that change can surprise you. Sometimes the people you think you know turn out to be completely different. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Henry cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass, while Carter suddenly became very interested in his soup. But Margaret and Juliet weren't backing down. They sensed weakness, and they were closing in for the kill. Well, Margaret said, her voice taking on that particular tone of voice that made my skin crawl, I suppose we're all products of our upbringing, aren't we? Some people are just naturally more refined than others. The word hung in the air like a noose. Refined. Another way of saying I wasn't. Another way of pointing out that no matter how I dressed or spoke or carried myself, I would always be the girl from the trailer park who somehow tricked their son into marriage. Ethan's hand found mine under the table, squeezing so tight I could feel his wedding ring pressing into my palm. But he didn't speak, didn't defend me, just sat there while his mother served up another helping of casual cruelty, while his siblings exchanged looks that said they were enjoying the show. I thought about all the dinners I'd sat through like this, all the holidays where I'd bitten my tongue until it bled, all the gatherings where I'd smiled and nodded while they made jokes at my expense, all the times Ethan had chosen his family's comfort over my dignity, chosen keeping the peace over keeping his promise to honor and protect me. The main course arrived, some kind of beef that probably cost more per pound than I used to spend on groceries in a week. I cut into it carefully, watching the juice run red across my plate like spilled blood. The metaphor wasn't lost on me.
"This is delicious, Margaret," I said, my voice steady as stone. "You'll have to give me the recipe." She laughed, the sound like broken crystal. "I didn't cook it, dear. That's what the staff is for." Of course. Another reminder that I was the kind of person who cooked her own meals, who cleaned her own house, who worked for her money instead of inheriting it. Another way of pointing out that I didn't belong here, would never belong here, no matter how hard I tried to fit in. "Must be nice," I said quietly, "having people to take care of everything for you." "It is," Margaret agreed, completely missing the edge in my voice. "Though I suppose some people prefer the hands-on approach." Hands-on. Like it was something dirty, something beneath them. Like working for what you had was a character flaw instead of a point of pride. The conversation drifted to other topics: charity galas and country club gossip, stock portfolios and vacation homes. I listened with half an ear, my mind elsewhere, thinking about the trust fund statements sitting in my desk drawer at home, thinking about the phone number for my attorney saved in my contacts, thinking about all the ways this conversation could change if they knew the truth about who they were really talking to. But I stayed quiet, kept my secrets locked away where they couldn't hurt anyone, couldn't change the dynamic of this perfect family dinner where everyone knew their place and I knew mine. After all, what good would it do to upset the balance? What good would it do to reveal that the woman they'd been treating like hired help for 3 years was actually worth more than their entire estate combined? I was about to find out. The tension had been building like a storm all evening, pressure mounting with each passive-aggressive comment and barely concealed insult. But storms don't last forever. Eventually, lightning strikes. Margaret set down her wine glass with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to deliver a killing blow. The crystal chimed against the mahogany table like a bell, signaling the start of a boxing match. Her smile was razor-sharp, her eyes bright with the kind of malicious joy that came from finally saying what you'd been thinking all along. "You know, Clara," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of false friendliness that made my spine straighten like a soldier hearing enemy fire. "I have to say, you've adapted remarkably well to all of this." She gestured around the dining room with one manicured hand, indicating the oil paintings and crystal chandeliers, the family crest on the china, the generational wealth displayed like trophies on every surface. "All of this?" I asked quietly, though I already knew where she was heading. I could feel it in the way Juliet leaned forward, in the way Carter tried to hide his smirk behind his napkin, in the way Henry's eyes sharpened with anticipation. And Ethan just sat there, his face pale but his mouth closed, choosing his family's cruel entertainment over his wife's dignity. Again. Well, this lifestyle, Margaret continued, her voice getting sweeter with every word, the social expectations, the proper etiquette, the elevated company, it must feel quite different from what you're used to. Mother, Ethan warned, but his voice was weak, lacking conviction. He knew what was coming too, but he wasn't going to stop it. Never did. Oh, I'm just making conversation, darling, Margaret said, turning that poisonous smile on her son for a moment before swivering back to me. I'm sure Clara doesn't mind talking about her background. After all, we're family. Family. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I'm comfortable talking about my childhood, though I'm not sure what you'd like to know. Oh, just curious about the adjustment. I mean, going from trailer parks to, well, all this. It must feel like you're in a completely different world. The words hit like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. Wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Around the table, I could feel everyone holding their breath, waiting to see how I'd react. Juliet's eyes were bright with excitement. Carter was openly grinning now. Henry watched with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly interesting car accident. And Ethan just sat there, his face pale but his mouth closed, choosing his family's cruel entertainment over his wife's dignity. Again, it is different, I admitted quietly, but people adapt. Oh, absolutely, Margaret agreed, her voice rising now, emboldened by my apparent submission, though I suppose some transitions are more dramatic than others. I imagine you must feel right at home here now, so far from the trailer parks and all that atmosphere.
She practically spat the last word, like my childhood was something diseased, something that might contaminate her perfect dining room just by being acknowledged. Around the table, her children started to laugh. First Juliet's high-pitched giggle, then Carter's deeper chuckle, then Henry's rumbling approval. "Mother, that's enough," Ethan said, but his voice was still weak, still more concerned with avoiding confrontation than protecting his wife. "Oh, lighten up, Ethan," Margaret said, waving him off like he was a troublesome child. "Clara knows we're just teasing, don't you, dear?" Just teasing. Like 3 years of systematic humiliation was all in good fun. Like every snide comment and backhanded compliment had been delivered with love, instead of calculated cruelty. I looked around the table, taking in their faces. Margaret's triumphant smile, Juliet and Carter's obvious enjoyment, Henry's cold approval. And Ethan, my husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, sitting there like a statue while his family carved me up for their entertainment. Something inside me cracked. Not broke, that would come later, but cracked like ice under pressure, letting the cold truth seep through. They would never respect me, never see me as anything more than the trailer trash girl who'd somehow seduced their precious son. No amount of politeness on my part would change their minds. No amount of grace would earn their acceptance. I could sit through 1,000 dinners like this, swallow 1,000 insults, bite my tongue until it bled, and they would still see me as beneath them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Ethan's silence. The way he'd rather preserve the peace than preserve my dignity. The way he'd rather keep his family comfortable than keep his promise to me. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "It is quite an adjustment." I set my napkin down with the same deliberate precision Margaret had used with her wine glass. The linen was pristine white, expensive, probably cost more than the entire dinner table set I'd grown up eating on. Everything in this house cost more than everything I'd had as a child, and they wanted to make sure I never forgot that. "If you'll excuse me," I said, standing with the fluid grace I'd learned from years of being watched, judged, evaluated like a show horse at auction, I need to powder my nose. The euphemism was deliberately old-fashioned, the kind of phrase Margaret herself might use. But there was nothing polite about the steel in my voice, nothing ladylike about the way I looked at each of them in turn before walking away. Their laughter followed me out of the dining room, Juliet's voice carrying over the others. "Well, that was fun. Think she'll come back, or should we start the dessert course without her?" More laughter, more casual cruelty, more proof that I had never been a person to them. Just a target, just entertainment for their boredom. I walked through their perfect house with their perfect furniture and perfect paintings, my heels clicking against marble floors that probably had been imported from Italy, past trophy cases filled with ribbons I'd never win, past photographs of charity events I'd never be invited to, past portraits of ancestors who would never claim me as family. In the guest bathroom, I locked the door and stared at my reflection in a mirror that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. My face looked calm, composed, exactly what you'd expect from someone who just excused herself politely from dinner. But my eyes were different. Harder. Colder. I pulled out my phone with steady hands and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Thomas Avery, attorney at law. The man who'd helped me set up the trust, who knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. "Thomas," I said when he answered on the second ring, "it's Clara. I need you to be available for a call in about 10 minutes. Speakerphone." "Is everything all right?" I looked at myself in that expensive mirror, at the woman who'd spent 3 years trying to earn respect from people who would never give it, who hid her true worth to avoid being seen as a gold digger, who stayed silent while her husband's family treated her like garbage. "Everything's about to be," I said. "Just be ready." I hung up and took off my earrings, small gold studs that had belonged to my mother, one of the few things of value she'd owned. They were modest, simple, and real. Everything this house wasn't. I slipped them into my purse and looked at myself one more time. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who'd walked into this bathroom. This woman had made a choice. This woman was done being silent. Time to show the Bishop family exactly who they'd been talking to all this time. Time to remind them that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding all the cards. I smoothed my dress, checked my lipstick, and walked back towards the dining room with the calm confidence of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. The laughter died when I appeared in the doorway. Something in my expression, in the way I carried myself, made them all go quiet. Even Margaret looked uncertain for the first time all evening. "Sorry about that," I said, settling back into my chair like nothing had happened. "Now, where were we?" But everything had happened. Everything had changed. They just didn't know it yet. I reached for my phone and set it on the table next to my wine glass, my fingers steady as a surgeon's. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying a new authority that made them all sit up straighter, "I think we should talk about that development deal you mentioned, the one with all the property complications." Henry frowned, confused by the shift in tone. "I don't think you need to worry about—" "Oh, but I do," I said, my smile as sharp as Margaret's had been just minutes before. "You see, I'm very interested in family trusts, particularly the ones that control undeveloped land in this area." I dialed Thomas's number and hit the speaker before anyone could object. The ringing filled the dining room like a drumbeat, each tone a countdown to the moment everything changed. "Thomas Avery speaking." "Hello, Thomas," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm here with my husband's family, and we're discussing the Riverside Development Project. Could you please confirm for everyone here who owns the land in question?" Silence. Complete, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop on that expensive carpet. "Certainly, Mrs. Bishop," Thomas said,
his professional voice filling the room like a judge reading a verdict. The 300-acre tract, known as Riverside, is owned by the Ellis Santiago Trust, established in 2019. You are the sole trustee and beneficiary. Margaret's fork clattered to her plate. Henry's face went white as his napkin. Juliet and Carter looked like they'd been slapped. And Ethan just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Thank you, Thomas," I said calmly. "And could you also confirm the current estimated value of the trust?" "Approximately $90 million, Mrs. Bishop, including the Riverside property and other holdings." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear Henry's labored breathing, could hear the sound of an entire family's assumptions crumbling like a house built on sand. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Margaret's shock, Henry's disbelief, Juliet and Carter's open-mouthed stares, and finally Ethan's mixture of pride and shame that made my heart ache even as my spine straightened with vindication. "So you see," I said, my voice cutting through their stunned silence like a blade, "when you talk about trailer trash at your dinner table," I paused, letting the words hang in the air like a noose. "You're talking about the woman who could buy and sell this entire estate before dessert arrives?" The bathroom had become my war room. I stared at my reflection in that ridiculously expensive mirror, watching my chest rise and fall with controlled breaths. My lipstick was still perfect, my hair hadn't moved, but inside, everything had shifted like tectonic plates finding new ground. $90 million. The number echoed in my mind like a prayer, like a weapon, like a shield I'd been carrying without ever learning how to use it. Thomas's voice had cut through their shock like a scalpel, precise and undeniable. The look on their faces, Margaret's fork suspended halfway to her mouth, Henry's wine glass trembling in his grip, Juliet and Carter frozen like deer in headlights. And Ethan just stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. My phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Are you all right? That sounded intense." I typed back quickly. "Perfect timing. Thank you. Want me to stay on standby?" "Please. This conversation isn't over." I set the phone down and really looked at myself. Not the way Margaret looked at me, cataloging flaws and finding them wanting. Not the way Juliet looked at me, like I was some fascinating specimen of social climbing. I looked at myself the way I should have been looking all along. I saw a woman who'd built a career from nothing, who'd earned every degree, every promotion, every dollar in her own bank account before the trust fund ever existed, who'd loved a man enough to hide her wealth so he'd know she wanted him, not his family's approval.
Endured 3 years of systematic humiliation because she'd believed that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping her dignity. I'd been wrong about that last part. My reflection smiled back at me, but it wasn't the polite smile I'd been wearing all evening. This was something sharper, more honest, the smile of a woman who'd finally remembered who she was. I thought about my grandfather, Eduardo Santiago, the man who'd left my pregnant mother but spent 30 years building an empire out of guilt and regret. Real estate, tech investments, a few small oil wells that had turned into very large fortunes. He'd tried to contact me once when I was in college, but pride had kept me from answering. Pride and the memory of my mother crying over bills she couldn't pay while he lived in mansions she'd never see. When he died, I'd expected nothing. Got everything instead. A letter explaining that he'd watched my career from a distance, proud of what I'd accomplished without his help. The trust fund was his apology, his way of giving me choices he never gave my mother. I'd kept it secret because I was afraid people would see dollars instead of dreams, afraid they'd question every achievement, every relationship, every moment of genuine connection, afraid I'd never know who loved Clara the person versus Clara the trust fund. But here's what I'd learned tonight. Some people were always going to see me as less than, no matter what I achieved or how much I was worth. Margaret would have found something to despise about me if I'd been royalty. My background was just convenient ammunition. And Ethan? God, Ethan! He'd known about the trust fund for 6 months now. I'd told him after our second anniversary, when I couldn't bear keeping secrets from the man I'd married. He'd been stunned, then proud, then worried about what his family would think. "They'll assume you married me for money," he'd said. "Won't they assume the opposite now?" I'd asked. He'd gone quiet then, the way he always did when conversations got uncomfortable. We'd never talked about it again, never discussed how to handle his family's treatment of me, never acknowledged that I had the power to change our entire dynamic with a single bank statement. Instead, I'd kept playing the role they'd written for me, the grateful trailer park girl who'd won the lottery by marrying into their family, the woman who should be thankful for every scrap of acceptance they threw my way. Well, I was done being grateful for cruelties. Another text buzzed through, this one from Ethan. "Clara, are you okay? Please come back." I almost laughed. Now he was worried. Now that his family knew I wasn't the helpless little nobody they could ridicule over dinner, now he wanted to check on my feelings. I typed back, "Be right there. We need to finish this conversation." Because that's what this was going to be. A conversation, not a confrontation. I wasn't going to scream or throw things or storm out in a dramatic exit. That's what they'd expect from someone like me, someone from my background. Trailer trash behavior, they'd call it later, when they were analyzing this dinner party for years to come. Instead, I was going to be exactly what they'd claimed I could never be. Refined, controlled, unshakable. I reapplied my lipstick with steady hands, smoothed my dress, and checked my phone one more time. Thomas was still standing by. My bank app showed account balances that could buy their lifestyle twice over. My reflection showed a woman who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. Time to teach the Bishop family a lesson they'll never forget. Never underestimate someone just because you think you know their story. The hallway felt different as I walked back toward the dining room. The oil paintings of dead bishops didn't seem quite so intimidating now. The marble floors didn't echo with the same authority. Even the grandfather clock seemed to tick with less certainty, like time itself was holding its breath to see what happened next. I could hear their voices as I approached, urgent whispers, hissed arguments, the sound of a family in crisis trying to figure out damage control. Margaret's voice cut through the others. How were we supposed to know? She never said anything. Henry's rumble. $90 million? Jesus Christ! Juliet's plaintive. She's been sitting there letting us do what? Ethan's voice, sharper than I'd ever heard it. Humiliate her? Mock her background? Treat her like she was beneath us? Finally, he was finding his voice. Carter's nervous laugh. I mean, you have to admit it's kind of funny. All this time we thought, shut up, Carter. Ethan again, and I felt a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with. Just shut up. I paused outside the doorway, listening to my husband defend me for the first time in 3 years. Better late than never, I supposed. But too late and too little for him to avoid the conversation we were about to have. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked back into that dining room like I owned it, which, technically, I could. The conversation died the moment I appeared. 4 sets of eyes tracked my movement as I settled back into my chair, each face wearing a different expression of barely contained panic. Margaret's composure had cracked like week-old paint, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Henry sat rigid as a statue, his business mind clearly calculating and recalculating what my revelation meant for their precious development deal. Juliet and Carter looked like children caught stealing cookies, all wide eyes and guilty silence. But it was Ethan who held my attention. My husband sat forward in his chair, wedding ring catching the candlelight as he reached for my hand. I let him take it, felt his palms sweating against mine, his thumb tracing nervous circles across my knuckles. "Clara," he started, his voice thick with emotion. Let's finish dinner first," I said quietly, my tone as calm as Sunday morning church. "Thomas is still on standby, and I'd hate to keep him waiting too long." The mention of my attorney sent another ripple of tension around the table. Margaret's wine glass trembled in her grip. Henry cleared his throat like he was preparing to negotiate for his life, which, in a way, he was. I picked up my fork and took a delicate bite of the beef, chewing slowly while they all watched. The meat was perfectly prepared, tender, seasoned, probably cost more per pound than most people's weekly grocery budget. But it might as well have been cardboard for all the attention I was paying to the taste. "This really is excellent," I said, dabbing my lips with my napkin. "You'll have to give my compliments to the chef." The normality of the comment seemed to unnerve them more than any dramatic declaration could have. Margaret's carefully constructed mask slipped another notch. "Clara, dear," she began, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining civility, "perhaps we should discuss." "The Riverside development?" "Yes, I think we should. It's fascinating, really. 300 acres of prime real estate, strategic location, enormous potential for profit." I took another sip of wine, letting them hang on every word. Thomas mentioned some complications with the land ownership. Family trusts can be so complex. Henry leaned forward, his business mind overriding his shock. "Clara, we had no idea you were involved with the property. If we'd known, would it have changed anything?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. "Would you have treated me differently at these family dinners? Would the jokes about my background have seemed less funny?" Silence. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that fills a room when uncomfortable truths are dragged into the light. "That's not fair," I finished for her. "No, I don't suppose it is. But then again, neither was spending 3 years listening to your family discuss me like I wasn't in the room. Neither was being called trailer trash at my own family dinner house." The words hit like roots of the universe. Even Henry had the grace to look ashamed, though whether it was for his behavior or for getting caught was unclear. Ethan's grip on my hand tightened. "Clara, I'm sorry. We're all sorry. If you'd known I had money. That's what you mean, isn't it? If you'd known I was worth something, you would have treated me better. But the woman who married your son, who loved your family despite everything, who kept her mouth shut through years of casual cruelty, wasn't worth basic respect?" "That's not what he meant," Margaret said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I asked, because from where I'm sitting, it sounds exactly like what he meant. I turned to address the table at large, my voice carrying the kind of authority I'd been hiding for too long. "Let me ask you something. What did you think would happen tonight? Did you think I'd sit here and swallow another insult? Did you think I'd go home and cry into my pillow while you all laughed about putting the trailer trash in her place? You weren't what? Enjoying yourselves? Because the laughter seemed pretty genuine to me." I reached for my phone, finger hovering over Thomas's contact. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call my attorney back, and we're going to discuss the terms under which the Riverside development might proceed, or might not proceed, depending on how this conversation goes." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Henry's face went pale as he realized what I was saying. His biggest deal, the project he'd been bragging about all evening, the development that would cement his legacy, all of it depended on the woman he just watched his wife humiliate.
"Clara," he said carefully, switching to the tone he probably used in boardrooms when negotiations got delicate. "I understand you're upset. You have every right to be. But this is business. We've invested significant resources. Have you? I asked, tilting my head with genuine curiosity. Because according to my information, you haven't actually purchased the land yet. You've been operating under the assumption that you could pressure the trust into selling at below market rates. Something about poor management and people who don't understand the value of progress. Henry's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Margaret set down her wineglass with shaking hands. The offers your lawyers have been making, I continued conversationally, are about 40% below fair market value. I assume you thought you were dealing with some doddering old trustee who didn't understand real estate development, someone you could intimidate or manipulate into accepting terms that would benefit you at their expense. We didn't know, Henry said weakly. No, you didn't. And you didn't care to find out either. You saw an opportunity to exploit what you thought was someone else's ignorance, and you took it. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The irony is almost poetic, don't you think? You've been trying to screw over your own daughter-in-law. Ethan made a sound like he'd been punched. Clara, Jesus, I didn't know about the land offers. I swear I didn't know. I believed him. Ethan was many things. Conflict avoidant, weak-willed when it came to his family, too eager to keep everyone happy. But he wasn't malicious, not like his parents. I know you didn't, I said gently, and his relief was palpable. But your parents did, your siblings did. They all knew exactly what they were trying to do. It's just business, Carter said weakly. No, I corrected him, my voice sharp as a blade. Business is making fair offers and honest negotiations. What you are doing is called fraud. Attempting to purchase property under false pretenses, deliberately concealing material information, trying to manipulate someone you thought was unsophisticated into accepting terms that would benefit you at their expense. I let that sink in before continuing. Thomas has been documenting everything. Every phone call, every lowball offer, every attempt to pressure the trust into selling. It would make for very interesting reading in a courtroom. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock anymore. This was fear. The fear of people who'd gotten caught with their hands in the cookie jar and were just beginning to understand the consequences. Margaret tried one more time to regain control. Clara, surely we can work this out like civilized people. We're family. Are we? I asked, cutting her off. Because for the last 3 years, you've made it very clear that I'm not family. I'm an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a gold digger who somehow tricked your son into marriage. I stood up slowly, my napkin falling to the table like a white flag of surrender. But not mine. Theirs. But you're right about one thing, Margaret. We are going to work this out like civilized people. We're going to have a very civilized conversation about respect and consequences and what it's going to take for the Riverside development to move forward. I picked up my phone and hit the call button. Thomas answered on the first ring. Thomas, it's Clara. I'm ready to discuss the Riverside property with my husband's family. Are you available to walk through our options? Absolutely, Mrs. Bishop. I have all the files right here. I looked around the table at their pale faces, their shocked expressions, and their sudden understanding that the woman they'd been treating like dirt held their dreams in her hands. Wonderful, I said, my smile sharp enough to cut glass. Let's begin. Thomas, I said into the phone, my voice carrying clearly through the dining room's sudden silence, could you please explain to my husband's family exactly what the Ella Santiago Trust controls? Certainly, Mrs. Bishop. In addition to the Riverside property, the trust holds approximately $12 million in tech stock, $15 million in municipal bonds, $18 million in various real estate holdings throughout Texas and California, and approximately $45 million in diversified investments. I watched their faces as the numbers sank in. Margaret's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way all color drained from her cheeks. Henry's hand gripped his wineglass so tight I thought it might shatter. Juliet and Carter sat frozen like deer caught in headlights. Their earlier smugness evaporated into thin air. And the total current value? I asked, though I already knew the answer. As of this morning's market close, approximately $92,400,000. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked through 10 seconds of absolute silence. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The crystal chandelier above us might as well have been a guillotine for how it seemed to hang over their heads. Ethan was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time, his face cycling through shock, pride, and something that looked dangerously close to worship. But it was the others I was watching. The people who'd spent 3 years treating me like an inconvenient charity case. Thomas, I continued, my tone as casual as if we were discussing the weather. Remind me what Henry Bishop's initial offer was for the Riverside property? Papers rustled on the other end of the line. $38 million for all 300 acres, Mrs. Bishop, well below the appraised value of $62 million. Henry made a choking sound. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate like broken dreams. $62 million, I repeated thoughtfully. That's quite a discrepancy, isn't it? Almost like someone was hoping to take advantage of what they assumed was an unsophisticated property owner. It would appear so, yes. I turned my attention to Henry, who looked like he was having some kind of medical emergency. His face had gone from pale to gray to an alarming shade of purple. Henry, I said gently, the way you might address a child who'd been caught lying, would you like to explain to Thomas why your initial offer was 40% below fair market value? The market analysis, he stumbled over words like a man drowning in his own excuses. The market analysis showed exactly what Thomas just confirmed, $62 million minimum. Your own appraiser, Johnson and Associates, I believe, provided that number 6 months ago. Did you think I wouldn't see that report? Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. Clara, surely we can discuss this privately. The way you discussed calling me trailer trash privately, I asked. Oh, wait, that wasn't private, was it? That was right here, at this dinner table, in front of everyone. We didn't mean, Juliet started. Didn't mean what? Didn't mean for me to find out who really owns the land your family's been trying to steal? Didn't mean for the trailer trash to turn out to be richer than all of you combined? I let that sink in for a moment. The math was simple enough even for them to follow. Their house, their cars, their country club memberships, their perfectly manicured lifestyle, all of it together probably didn't add up to half of what I had sitting in various accounts. Thomas, I said, returning to the phone, what would you estimate the Bishop family's net worth to be based on the financial information they provided during the initial development discussions? More paper shuffling. Based on their disclosure statements, approximately $43 million in combined assets, Mrs. Bishop, though a significant portion of that appears to be tied up in the Riverside development project. I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. So, just to make sure everyone understands the situation, the woman you've been treating like hired help is worth more than twice what your entire family has, and she owns the land your biggest business deal depends on. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ethan's hand found mine under the table, squeezing so tight I could feel his wedding ring digging into my skin. Clara, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. God, I'm so sorry. You should be, I said quietly, but my anger wasn't for him. Not entirely. But your apology isn't the one I'm waiting for. All eyes turned to Margaret, who sat rigid as a statue, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer dress suddenly looking like a costume she was wearing to play a part she no longer understood. She began, then stopped, her mouth opening and closing like she'd forgotten how to form words. Go ahead, Margaret, I encouraged. I'm listening. This is impossible. You're from a trailer park. Your mother was a waitress. We saw the background check. Background check? My voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. You ran a background check on me?
No, I cut her off, my voice ringing with an authority I'd kept hidden too long. You've had 3 years to treat me with basic human decency.
3 years to see that I loved your son, that I was good to him, that I never asked for anything from any of you except acceptance. Instead, you ran background checks and made jokes about trailer parks and called me trash at family dinners. I stood up slowly, my phone still connected to Thomas, still broadcasting this humiliation to the one person who'd always believed I deserved better. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice cutting through their stunned silence like a blade. The Riverside development can still proceed, but it's going to proceed on my terms, with my approval, at fair market value. And every single one of you is going to remember that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on where they came from instead of who they are. Carter finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. Clara, we didn't know. That's right, I said, cutting him off. You didn't know. You didn't bother to know. You saw a trailer park girl who married into money, and you decided that was all you needed to see. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn, but I know exactly who each of you are. I've spent 3 years watching you, listening to you, learning how you think and what you value. And what I've learned is that you don't value people, you value possessions. I picked up my purse, checking to make sure I had everything. Thomas, are you still there? Yes, Mrs. Bishop. Please prepare a formal counteroffer for the Riverside property, fair market value, plus a 20% premium for the inconvenience of dealing with people who tried to defraud me. Certainly. Anything else? Yes. I want a full audit of all communications between the Bishop family and their attorneys regarding this deal. If we find evidence of deliberate fraud or conspiracy, we'll be filing both civil and criminal charges. The words hit like bombs. Margaret gasped. Henry's face went white as his napkin. Juliet started crying, actual tears streaming down her carefully contoured cheeks. Clara, please, Ethan said, standing up beside me. They're my family. I looked at my husband, the man I'd loved enough to hide my wealth, the man I'd protected from gold digger accusations by letting his family think I was beneath them, the man who'd sat silent while they carved me up for entertainment. They're your family, I agreed, but I'm your wife. And for 3 years, you've let them treat your wife like garbage while you worry about keeping the peace. I touched his cheek gently, sadly. Maybe it's time you decided which matters more to you, their comfort or my dignity. I turned back to the table, where 4 of the richest people in Austin sat looking like their world had just collapsed around them, which in a way, it had. Dinner was lovely, I said politely. Thank you for having me. Thomas, please send the paperwork to Henry's office first thing Monday morning. Of course, Mrs. Bishop. Have a good evening. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse. The dining room that had seemed so intimidating when I had arrived now felt small, cramped, diminished, like a stage set after the play was over and the audience had gone home. One more thing, I said, pausing at the doorway. The next time you want to have a conversation about trailer trash, you might want to make sure you know who you're talking to first. I walked out of that house with my head high, my dignity intact, and 92 million reasons why I'd never have to take their shit again. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's voice, sharp with an anger I'd never heard before. Are you all out of your goddamn minds? Better late than never, I thought. But some things once broken take more than apologies to fix. The real conversation was just beginning. The silence in the car was deafening. Ethan gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality, his knuckles white against the leather. We'd been driving for 10 minutes without a word, the Bishop estates shrinking in the rearview mirror like a bad dream finally fading away. Say something, he finally whispered. I stared out the window at the manicured lawns and perfect houses, each one hiding its own secrets behind pristine facades. What would you like me to say? I don't know. Anything. Yell at me, tell me I'm a coward, tell me you're leaving me. The pain in his voice cut deeper than any of his family's insults. I turned to look at him. Really look at him. His face was drawn with exhaustion and shame, his eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears.
I'm not leaving you, I said quietly, but I'm done pretending to be smaller than I am to make other people comfortable. He pulled over suddenly, parking under a streetlight that cast everything in harsh yellow shadows. His hand shook as he turned off the engine.
Clara, I'm so sorry. I should have defended you years ago. I should have shut them down the first time they made a comment about your background. His voice cracked. I was afraid of losing them, but I was losing you instead. Yes, you were. I didn't sugarcoat it, couldn't anymore. Every dinner, every holiday, every time you let them treat me like an outsider, you chose them over me. I know. The words came out like a confession. I know, and I hate myself for it. When you walked out tonight, when you showed them who you really are, God, Clara, I was so proud and so ashamed. My phone buzzed, a text from Thomas. Henry Bishop just called. I want to schedule a meeting ASAP. I showed Ethan the message. They're scared. Good, they should be. His voice carried steel I'd never heard before. What you did tonight, that was magnificent. Terrifying and magnificent. For the first time since dinner started, I smiled. A real smile, not the polite mask I'd been wearing for 3 years. Your mother's face when Thomas said 90 million, I said, and Ethan actually laughed. I thought she was going to faint. Dad looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He reached for my hand, hesitant, like he wasn't sure he had the right anymore. Can we get through this? I laced my fingers through his. We can try, but things are going to be different now. Different how? I'm never hiding again. Not my money, not my opinions, not my worth. If your family can't handle that, it's their problem, not mine. He nodded, squeezing my hand. I'll handle them. No, I said firmly. We'll handle them. Together. As equals. The word hung between us like a promise. Equals. Not the peacekeeping son and his trailer park wife, not the rich family and their charity case daughter-in-law. Partners. I love you, he said, and for the first time in months, I believed him completely. My phone rang as we pulled into our driveway. Margaret's name lit up the screen like a warning beacon. Ethan saw it too and made a disgusted sound. Don't answer it, he said. But I was curious. What could she possibly say now? I swiped to accept the call. Clara, dear. It's Mrs. Bishop now, I interrupted coolly. What can I do for you, Margaret? A pause. I could practically hear her grinding her teeth. I think there's been a misunderstanding tonight. Really? Which part? When you called me trailer trash or when you tried to steal my property? We didn't know. That's not an excuse. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You saw what you wanted to see and treated me accordingly. Ethan took the phone from my hand and put it on speaker. Mother, what exactly do you want? I want to make this right, Margaret said, her voice strained with the effort of humility she'd probably never had to practice before. Perhaps we could have lunch tomorrow, Clara. Just us girls. We could discuss— No. The word came out flat and final. You don't get to compartmentalize this. You don't get to have a private conversation to smooth things over so you can go back to treating me like dirt in public. But surely, here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, Thomas will send your husband a formal proposal for the Riverside property. Fair market value plus penalties. Your family will sign it or the deal dies completely. Clara, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Reasonable would be pressing criminal charges for attempted fraud. Reasonable would be calling every reporter in Austin and explaining how one of the city's most prominent families tried to swindle their own daughter-in-law. I let that threat hang in the air for a moment. This is me being generous.
Silence on the other end of the line. Then Henry's voice, rough with defeat. What are your terms? Finally, the businessman in him had overridden the wounded patriarch. $75 million for the property, public apology from your wife, and a written agreement that any future family gatherings will treat me with the respect due to your son's wife. $75 million? Margaret's voice climbed an octave. That's highway robbery. No, I said calmly. Highway robbery is what you tried to do to me. This is justice. I paused, then added the final knife twist. Oh, and Margaret, the next time you want to run a background check on someone, you might want to do it properly. A real investigation would have found the trust fund years ago. I hung up before she could respond.
Ethan was staring at me with something between awe and arousal. That was, he started. Necessary, I finished. They needed to understand that actions have consequences. We sat in our car in our driveway, looking at our modest house with its normal lawn and regular windows, nothing like the Bishop estate with its intimidating grandeur. But it was ours, bought with my salary and his, chosen together, filled with love instead of judgment. "Do you think they'll agree to the terms?" Ethan asked. My phone buzzed with another text from Thomas. "Henry Bishop wants to meet first thing Monday. Sounds desperate." "They'll agree," I said with certainty. "They don't have a choice." Monday morning arrived like a reckoning. I dressed carefully for the meeting, not to impress, but to project the authority I'd kept hidden for too long. Charcoal gray suit, my grandmother's pearls, heels that clicked with purpose against marble floors. Thomas's office was neutral territory, all leather and mahogany, and the kind of understated wealth that whispered instead of shouting. Henry and Margaret sat across from us like defendants at their own trial, their expensive clothes unable to hide how diminished they looked. "Mrs. Bishop," Henry began, his voice carefully modulated, "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding." There was no misunderstanding. There was deliberate deception. You tried to defraud someone you thought couldn't fight back. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Amazing what $90 million could do to someone's attitude. Thomas slid a folder across the table. "The terms are non-negotiable. $75 million for the Riverside property, public statement of regret for the misunderstanding, and a formal agreement regarding future family interactions." Henry opened the folder with shaking hands. His face went gray as he read. "These penalty clauses are standard for contracts involving fraud attempts," Thomas said mildly. "Mrs. Bishop is being quite generous, considering." "We accept," Margaret said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry shot her a look of surprise, but she just stared at her hands. The fight had gone out from her completely. "Excellent," Thomas said, producing pens. "If you'll sign here." The papers rustled like dry leaves. Henry's signature looked shaky, defeated. Margaret's was barely legible. But they signed. Both of them. All of it. When it was done, Margaret finally looked up at me. "You underestimated me." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." "Will this—" She paused, searching for words. "Change things between our families?" I considered the question seriously. These people had spent 3 years making me feel worthless, but they were still Ethan's parents, still his blood. "That depends entirely on you," I said finally. "Respect is earned, not bought, not inherited, not demanded. Earned." She nodded slowly, like she was learning a foreign language. "I understand." Did she? I wasn't sure, but it was a start. As we left the office, Thomas handed me a final document, the transfer papers for the Riverside deal. "Congratulations, Mrs. Bishop. You've just made $50 million. $50 million. More than the entire Bishop family was worth. Made in a single morning because I'd finally stopped hiding who I was." Walking to our car, Ethan slipped his arm around my waist. "How does it feel?"
I thought about it as we drove home. How did it feel to finally stand up for myself, to demand the respect I'd always deserved, to show the world that the trailer park girl they'd dismissed was actually the most powerful person in the room? "Like, I should have done it years ago," I said. But maybe I hadn't been ready years ago. Maybe I'd need those 3 years of humiliation to find the steel in my spine, to learn the difference between keeping the peace and keeping my dignity. Either way, one thing was certain. Clara Bishop was done being underestimated. 6 months later, I sat on our back porch watching the sunset, paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Riverside development is breaking ground next week. under my terms, with my approval, generating profits that will fund the scholarship program I'm establishing for kids from trailer parks who dare to dream bigger. Ethan brings me tea, kisses my temple, settles beside me like this is where he's always belonged. The Bishop family dinners are different now. Polite, respectful, careful. Margaret says please and thank you. Henry asks my opinion on business matters. It's not love, but it's something better. Recognition. I learned something that night at their perfect dinner table. Silence isn't golden when it costs you your soul. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be small anymore. The trailer park girl they tried to erase, she bought their dreams and made them better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.